Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Dharma podcast. Now, this is a rather impromptu episode and it was triggered by something I read earlier today. And that was an article about Russian President Vladimir Putin's 2021 speech. It was delivered at the Valdai International Discussion Club and it holds several important lessons, and his speech has an evergreen quality to it, and it was largely underreported by the Western media. Few comments were made in the Western press and its whole ecosystem, for a very straightforward reason. Now, with that background, let's dive directly into today's episode. Now, like I said, the Putin's speech was severely underreported by the Western media and especially the American media, because his speech hit the West where it hurts the most. It hit the heart of the woke phenomenon. And in fact, his speech was a frontal attack against the ever expanding gamut of woke insanity, which includes but is not limited to things like gender fluidity, reverse racism, erasing history, elimination of traditional values and ideas, and the destruction of the family unit. It's also a bit tragic that Putin's rather purposeful speech did not receive the attention it really deserves, even in India. And in fact, his speech is a courageous declaration of his intent to protect Russia from the toxic cancel culture of the West. And as far as India is concerned, and India is my only concern, my primary concern, India and the Sanatana civilization. So, as far as this is concerned, it is a tremendous opportunity to make a beginning of sorts, a beginning to build for itself and to retake Bharatavarsha's historical place, the exalted mantle as a global leader in all that is truly spiritual, culturally virtuous, noble, wise, and refined. Or, as they say in some circles, to reclaim the position of a term that is rather loosely used, Vishwaguru. But in the profoundest sense of that term, that great throne of Vishwaguru will and must be raised on the rebuilt foundations of the historical Sanatana civilizational superstructure. Now, coming to the woke mania, it represents the irretrievable summit of the bottomless decline of the West, which will only grow worse in the coming years. Take it from me. And this decline has come roughly after 300 years of unprecedented rape of the planet and an unrestrained decimation of hundreds of cultures and traditions and thousands of subcultures and tribes. But the greatest destruction that the colonial West has caused in these 300 years has been the destruction of the spirituality which is innate in all of us. So let me read out a small quote from Putin's speech I just mentioned. Quote, "This conservative approach is not about an ignorant traditionalism, a fear of change, or a restraining game, much less about withdrawing into our own shell. It is primarily about reliance on a time-tested tradition, the preservation and growth of the population, a realistic assessment of oneself and others, a precise alignment of priorities, a correlation of necessity and possibility, a prudent formulation of goals, and a fundamental rejection of extremism as a method. For us in Russia, these are not some speculative postulates, but lessons from our difficult and sometimes tragic history. the cost of ill-conceived social experiments is sometimes beyond estimation. Such actions can destroy not only the material, but also the spiritual foundations of human existence, leaving behind moral wreckage where nothing can be built to replace it for a long time. Close quote. These are truly brilliant words. Now let's go across the hemisphere and show me exactly one president of the United States in the last half century who spoke something like this, something as powerful, as culturally rooted as what Putin spoke. And why has not a single president spoken like that? Because that alleged Western civilization, especially America, is now in terminal decay, which is why it can no longer produce leaders of this caliber. The American situation is akin to the medieval Muslim invaders and barbarians who invaded Bharatavarsha and were dumbstruck at the awesome splendor of our temples, our art, and our sculptures. And they saw in these beautiful works of art a reflection of their own fear of true beauty and true spirituality. This kind of psyche, among others, is also why the US government, which is acting in concert with its corrupt media, still peddles the fiction that Russia is evil personified and that Putin is a monster. But as one of the proud inheritors of the values and ideals of the Sanatana spiritual civilization, I do not hold a candle either to the US or to Putin's Russia. But as a pragmatic and honest observer of the continuous unfolding of an alleged democracy in India after 1947, many parts of Putin's speech have much value to us. At best, India's democracy, even after more than 7 decades, can only be called preparatory. But this preparation, this continuous state of preparing, it has come at the cost of appalling cultural and spiritual erosion. And I have written extensively in an essay on the Dharma Dispatch website. The tighter we embrace Western democracy, the more Christianized our outlook and our attitudes will become. But in the present context, this danger that I mentioned is compounded by soul-sucking materialism, a materialism which is both the means and the end in itself. It can also be argued that this kind of unhinged, untrammeled materialism, it was and it remains a great contributor to the pathological leftist ideology. So Swami Vivekananda once famously said that you cannot preach philosophy to an empty stomach. The same thing holds true in a different way, in the opposite extreme, which is that you cannot preach wokeism to an empty stomach either. Now get hold of a far left intellectual, your leftist liberal academics, or your woke activists, social justice warrior, catch hold of one of those fellows and tell them to try and preach the so-called virtues and tolerance of a birthing parent to a person who earns less than 100 rupees a day. Let them try and do that. Or ask this woke person to go to a village in India and ask him or her or it to tell the women in these villages that these women must take consent from their infants, their own children, before they can breastfeed them, and see what happens to that woke activist. Like culture and spirituality, even degeneracy and insanity does not occur in a vacuum. So over this also has a slight historical context, and I'll try to kind of summarize it. The overfed, the fattened, and therefore the lazy nations, the former colonizers of the West after World War II, all these countries and cultures have steadily abandoned everything that was good and valuable in their own cultures, and they began experimenting with themselves. And a series of these experiments done over at least 60 years at the least, these experiments were the incubators that birthed, nurtured, and created the monster that is today known as the woke phenomenon and the cancel culture. And 5 years from now, this might acquire a new nomenclature depending on how heightened its craziness, its insanity is, but the fundamentals will remain the same. But the tragic fact for India is that its so-called elite have embraced wokeness wholesale. They've followed this poison pill wholesale. And the reason why they have swallowed it, like this, is the consequence of a conscious policy of deracination that was adopted by successive Nehruvian regimes in India. In fact, there has hardly been any decade of conscious decolonization after India got a questionable political independence. And in fact, the truth is quite the contrary. At every stage since independence under Congress regimes, at every stage when India was confronted by major problems, the first place that this deracinated political, academic, and intellectual elite, the first place that they all turned to was to the West. So they would, let's say there's a problem of, there's an economic problem. So they would look at, say, England's history or its society or its traditions, and they would ask, okay, what was England's solution to this economic problem? Or in some legal issue, they would look at, say, the American Constitution, and that ask, what does the American Constitution have? Does the American Constitution say something about this? Or why don't we adopt a French model for our own education system? Or what does Australia's defense policy say in some matter? This, we constantly looked towards the West for designing and implementing solutions for entirely homegrown problems, unique problems which had no precedence in any Western country. And so back in those days, when the initial Congress governments after independence were doing this kind of circus, back then, the iconic and legendary journalist, editor, literature, philosopher, poet from Karnataka, D.V. Gundappa, or DVG, this is what he wrote, and I quote, it's really beautiful. The mighty waves of the West have troubled the serene waters of the East, and their foam and fury are visible all over the globe. Will the flood of the Western influence rushing forth with its waves of militarism, imperialism, socialism, and all-absorbing materialism disturb all the accumulated peace of the East? To us in India, which is the center of Eastern civilization, the question is one of vital importance because it concerns a national, social, and individual welfare in the future. And we naturally ask, shall we forsake the holy Vedic philosophy and religion that our virtuous forefathers loved and lived and adopt the profit and loss philosophy of our Western brothers? Shall we believe that the soul is synonymous with stomach, and let the desire for personal comfort shatter our long established social system, giving room for growing discontent? Shall we discontinue our traditional religiousness and prefer commercialism to it? Shall we neglect the arts and sciences which our ancestors created and cultivated and favor the fashion fabric of the modern day, which shall we pay our homages to matter or to spirit? This was DVG. And at the moment, the tragic answer to all these questions is this: Western commercialism seems to have emerged victorious, at least in India. And nowhere is this victory more visible than in the category of our super rich Hindus whose psyches have been hijacked and rigged, especially by the American capitalist model. The early generations of big business houses like the Birlas and the Tatas and business houses of that league, they all contributed generously to temples, to mathas, to traditional education and traditional institutions, and a general spirit of dharma informed most of their philanthropic activities. Their role models and heroes included the likes of Swami Vivekananda. Shri J.R.D. Tata, was inspired by Swami Vivekananda to start the Tata Institute, known as the Indian Institute of Science. And other role models included Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi and the great Mahaperivar of Kanchi Paramacharya. The financial side of the philanthropy of that generations, it was an outward expression of their spiritual wealth, which they innately respected and revered. Fast forward today, the likes of big brands like Tanishq, they openly peddle advertisements that militate against these great rishis and sadhus and sages. And the current model of the philanthropy of all these business houses, it is an expression of insecurity, which is also what makes them exercise such tight control over charity. It's really an oxymoron and it's a misnomer. When the recipient is made to feel needy instead of deserving, charity is the direct inversion of the profound Sanatana philosophy of dana, about which I've also written on the Dharma Dispatch. You can all check it out. So, what are some of the ways out of this rather worrying situation? One answer, a familiar answer, is decolonization, or the rewiring of the psyche of this Hindu business class. And this rewiring, this decolonization, this return to the roots, it can only occur through an initial process of unlearning, and then a return to the proverbial native roots will occur automatically. But I'll also like to give a few pointers in this direction. One of the building blocks of Bharatavarsha's social structure, traditional social structure, it was and it remains the profound precept and practice of yagna. Yagna, the real meaning of yagna is sharing and not sacrifice. So even today, for example, most villagers, in traditional villages who have stuck on to their roots, no villager would refuse a stranger seeking food or a stranger who is hungry. But he would ask him, but if you ask these villagers why he does it, he has a one-word answer. Sir, Swami, I will get punya by, offering food. But then, how many of all these villagers have actually read, or how many of them fully understand the philosophical and the shastric reasoning behind this deeply spiritual and timeless tradition of food sharing? These villagers actually don't need to understand it in the intellectual sense, because this value is already in their DNA. And it is natural, almost like breathing, and it still pervades throughout India, and it is the same value that enabled our Tirthayatris or pilgrims throughout India's history to take shelter and food in the homes of strangers in faraway lands, in the homes of people whom they would never see again. And so, going back to the roots and reinculcating all such profound values is one of the first steps in the aforementioned re-education of our contemporary Hindu business class. I don't mean to generalize, but uh, this is observable among a huge chunk of the Hindu business class, which has been infected by American style predatory capitalism. But now, that said, let's go right back to the home of this capitalist culture, which is America. There, over the last 4 decades at least, a new business class has now acquired an almost unchallengeable power, which is fundamentally different from anything that we have seen in recent history. That is the about a history of about dating back to about 300 years. Now, in an earlier era, even in the first 2 decades of after the Second World War, even in that period, a good chunk of super rich businessmen in the West, in America, they were non-negotiable nationalists and genuine patriots. But today, look at the scene. It appears that no government in the Western hemisphere is powerful enough to punish just one George Soros, let alone 10 of them. These people, this new class of capitalists or business super rich businessmen, they recognize no borders, they recognize no laws, because the ego, what is known in the Sanatana tradition as mada or megalomania, that is truly borderless. And these new age sultans, they have enough and more money and power to feed the insatiable appetite of their mother, regardless of the costs. In a sense, they are practically playing God by engineering wars and violent regime changes, toppling entire governments, and several governments are helpless before them, which is something we can, easily verifiable, going back to just even 10 or 15 years. So even in this context, what Putin said in his speech, another important point that he made in his speech, is really bang on target, and I quote: "We look in amazement at the processes underway in the countries which have been traditionally looked at as the standard bearers of progress. Of course, the social and cultural shocks that are taking place in the United States and Western Europe are none of our business. We are keeping out of this. Some people in the West believe that an aggressive elimination of entire pages from their own history, reverse discrimination against the majority in the interest of a minority, and the demand to give up the traditional notions of mother, father, family, and even gender. They believe that all of these are the mileposts on the paths towards social renewal. They have a right to do this, but we are keeping out of this. But we would like to ask them to keep out of our business as well. We have a different viewpoint. At least the overwhelming majority of Russian society has a different opinion on this matter. We believe that we must rely on our own spiritual values, our historical tradition, and the culture of our multi-ethnic nation." Close quote. Now, remember who said this. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, the same country that first gave political power to communism. And the same communism which went on a rampage and completely ravaged its society, destroyed its history, and suffered, gross economic horrors. And when this communism fell in 1989 or 1991, what prevents the oldest and the continuously surviving, the only non-Abrahamic civilization, Bharatavarsha, what prevents Bharatavarsha to declare that dharma and only dharma is the bedrock and the backbone on whose strength Bharatavarsha will sculpt its ensuing destiny and its future? And it has to boast of a decisive leadership. Bharata has to boast of a decisive leadership and continuously evolve and produce that kind of leadership that can make such a frank declaration that Putin has made. It has to outline exactly what India stands for, and on Bharata's own independent merit, on the strength of its civilizational heritage and its spiritual convictions. Our ties with other nations must not be a barrier or a bargaining chip for negotiating our Hindu cultural foundations. This is the message for India. And it's not terribly new, actually. It, in a way, it echoes a remarkably insightful essay that the late, great Rishi Sadrisha, Shri Sitaram Goel, he had written a fantastic essay, a very insightful, very brilliant essay, as early as in 1956, when the Cold War was at its peak. Communist Russia, Soviet Russia was at its peak, and there was a huge arms race going on. So I'll read out a very small excerpt from Sitaram Goel's essay. Quote: What I see before my eyes is a neat division of labor between the United States and the Soviet Union, at least in this part of the world, that is, in India. The United States is trying to take care of our bodies, our kitchens, and our homes. The Soviet Union is taking care of our heads and showing extreme concern for our mental, moral, and spiritual needs. The United States builds schools and spreads literacy among the peasants. The Soviet Union provides them the newspapers they read. The United States erects factories in which the workers can earn a livelihood. The Soviet Union bands them together into trade unions, trains their leaders, and gives them a cause to die for. The United States gives scholarships to promising students for studies abroad. The Soviet Union equips them with the political glasses through which they can survey the world. The United States pampers regime after regime with a paraphernalia for pomp. The Soviet Union creates an elite capable of possessing power in every land. Close quote. This is truly extraordinary. The insights that Sitaramji provides are, unparalleled. Now, cut to our own time and let's look at the Russia of today. To paraphrase Putin's speech, this Russia of today has not only learned valuable lessons from that dark communist past, but it looks upon it as a poison and a nightmare which it has promised never to repeat. And look at the US on the other hand. The US seems to be in a tearing hurry to inflict the same communist nightmare upon itself. It has taken different names, left, far left, left liberal, woke, you name, social justice, you name it. But it is fundamentally, it is communism, except that the United States is inflicting this woke and this far left madness on other nations like India as well. And this is what we must severely guard against, whether we get business from the United States or not. And once again, I will quote from Sitaram Goel's same essay, where he provides some hints as to how we can, erect these safeguards. Quote: India is the home of Sanatana Dharma, a worldview which is at once eternal and universally valid. Sanatana Dharma alone rises above all sectarian semantics and sophistry and takes us straight into that sunshine of the Supreme Spirit which has sanctioned the rise and spread of communism and which will sanction its death and destruction as well. Let the spirit of Sanatana Dharma reawaken and spread once more in the land of its first immemorial dawns. To which I can only say, Sadhu, Sadhu, Sadhu. In closing, Bharatavarsha has suffered miserably, extremely, on an unprecedented scale. It has suffered for an entire millennium and is perhaps, uh, in a way, discarding its colonial and colonized crutches, and is somehow trying to find and is finally trying to firmly stand upright. And in the current global scenario, it is clear that there is no nation on the earth that can teach Bharatavarsha anything that it doesn't already know in the realms of statecraft, social organization, harmony, cultural refinement, civilization, and spirituality. The philosophy, society, culture, systems, and institutions that were introduced by, that were birthed by, and hailed as great role models by the so called leaders of the Western order are miserably failing in their own countries. Look at any democracy in Europe and look at the United States and even Canada. That's a large, chunk of the earth. Look at all these democracy. Show me one democracy out there which is stable. Show me one democracy out there which has which has a decisive answer, a clear answer to the menace of Islamic jihadism, which is running amok in all those countries. So, if democracies are rapidly failing in the land of their own birth, only a fool or an indoctrinated slave will choose to import a rotten vegetable from these alien lands, where, when there are tons and tons of abundant fresh vegetables available in his own backyard. And on that somewhat pensive and poignant note, we come to the close of today's impromptu uh, episode of the Dharma podcast. And I hope you have found it useful and it has provided some value to you. So please like this episode so that it reaches a wider audience. And please do subscribe to the Dharma podcast YouTube channel. And we also humbly request you to make a contribution if you find our content useful, so that we can offer you more such uh, fresh and interesting and insightful episodes in the future. Namaste, Sri Ramajayam.